Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 25, Israel Divided. The new king Rehoboam had arrived in the northern Israelite city of Shechem for his first public appearance, a meet and greet with the citizens. At this event, he is approached by Jeroboam, a local representative and one-time overseer of construction back in Jerusalem. Back then, a funny thing happened to Jeroboam. He had a vision that God would grant him a kingdom, and so naturally conspired to take down Solomon. The plot was discovered, and he fled to Egypt, where he was granted protection under the current pharaoh Shoshenq I. Now with the new regime change in Israel, he figured he could travel home and beg the new king for mercy, not only for himself, but for all Israel, saying to Rehoboam, "Your father was a harsh master. Lighten the labor demands and heavy taxes that your father imposed on us, and we will be your loyal subjects." Rehoboam mulled it over and replied, "Whereas my father laid heavy burdens on you, I shall make them heavier. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." What a fantastic threat! I think that's my favorite line in the whole book, although that's probably not what the crowd was thinking. Jeroboam is stunned, but instead of backing down, he calls out to the people, "To your tents, O Israel! Look after your own house, O David!" And everyone turned to follow him. Now, calling Rehoboam David refers to his lineage, much like those artifacts we talked about. This is also the equivalent of drawing a line in the sand. The house of David has pushed the north too much for too long, and this is the last straw. The angry mob escalates into full-blown rioting, and Rehoboam is forced to flee the city for his life back home to Jerusalem. Jeroboam will be the first king of an independent Israel, and Judah can deal with their own. You can imagine that Rehoboam wasn't going to accept this sitting down, although despite that his army was ready to crush the traitors, he chose not to attack, instead focusing on building defensive structures throughout Judah. The given reason is that God warned him not to attack his brethren, which is also the excuse he might have told his generals as well. But there is another more realistic reason here too. Judah might have the wealth and tradition, but the new kingdom of Israel is bigger, has a larger fighting force, better trade routes, and easy access to the Mediterranean. Some pretty big advantages. Over the next 5 long years, neither side presses the attack, aside from the occasional border skirmish, and this hostility continued until the arrival of a third player. The Old Testament calls him Shishak, but his real name is Sheshank, or Shoshenq I of the 22nd Dynasty, and the first Libyan Berber pharaoh. Coming to power within the Third Intermediate Period, Shoshenq had a lot to prove to his people. He's not an ethnic Egyptian, and we all remember how Egypt handles foreigners in charge, so to distract the public, Shoshenq heads off to war. Not just for conquest, but for plunder. And currently, the best place for treasure was Jerusalem. In the last episode, Solomon married the pharaoh Siamun's daughter, cementing an alliance between the two kingdoms. Since then, Siamun's dynasty is over, and his family no longer rules. Shoshenq had already shown himself a friend to Jeroboam, and therefore bore his kingdom no malice. But Judah, well, no one said anything about that. The Egyptian army is massive, fully prepared to lay siege to Jerusalem and crush the Judeans, although the fighting never comes. Instead of putting countless lives in danger, Rehoboam chooses to submit to Shoshenq without lifting a sword. Delighted at this cravenly display, Shoshenq accepts his surrender, but orders his men to completely plunder the Temple of Solomon anyway, taking everything of worth from the golden dinnerware to sacred objects. Possibly also the Ark of the Covenant, although that would contradict the story of the Ethiopians taking it, or the later Babylonians taking it. Let's just ignore that. Now, once the looting spree had ended, Shoshenq simply turned around and went home. Loads of filthy lucre to fund his dynasty, and leaving the Judeans significantly impoverished, but alive and free. Okay, our story now splits in two, and rather than bounce back and forth between the two kingdoms, we're going to leave Judah for the moment and concentrate on the new kingdom of Israel. It's less confusing this way, plus there's a lot more action up north. We start with King Jeroboam, and he's got a big problem. Israel might be politically independent from Judah, but what about spiritually? Everything that belonged to the Hebrews' faith resided in Jerusalem, capital of their enemies. Travel there is impossible now, so how does one convince a deeply devout people to ignore their most holy city? Doublespeak of the finest, of course. Jeroboam goes on a campaign to educate his citizens to reject the ways of Jerusalem and the Davidic rulers. It is they, not us, who have corrupted the worship of Yahweh. Their worship is tainted, and only through isolated reformation can we be saved from its vile influence. The shift away from Jerusalem would begin by erecting 2 golden calves in the towns of Bethel and Dan. Not to be worshipped, mind you, we all remember that part with Moses, but as iconography, a remembrance of the time spent in the desert. Jeroboam also changes the religious calendar, creates new festivals, and builds new shrines to his reformed religion. Even the rules of priesthood change, as he granted the right of ordinary citizens to serve. Traditionally, it was the Levites who were the only ones allowed to become priests, owing to their pious ancestry. Moses and Aaron were members of that tribe. While the Levites lived in the north, their livelihood had just been stripped away from them for this so-called Reformation. And stuck between a rock and a hard place, they saw no other choice but to head south to Judah and take the traditions and rituals of the Hebrew faith with them. In this manner, Judah continued to preserve the old ways of Abraham and Moses, which is why today the religion is called Judaism and not Israelism. Jeroboam ruled from Shechem until around 906 BC, when he was succeeded by his son Nadab. Nadab only gets 2 years under his belt before he in turn is slain in a coup by Baasha of the tribe Issachar. An ominous start for this nascent kingdom, although Baasha really ramps up the cruelty by having every family member of Nadab slaughtered and actively waging war against Judah and Philistia throughout his 24-year reign. His son Elah takes over when his father dies in 881, but in a delightful bit of karma, 2 years into his reign, he's slain by Zimri, a chariot commander who also has Baasha's family line wiped out. Pretty violent stuff, right? Hold on, I'm not done just yet. Upon hearing of this, the Israelite troops besieging the Philistine city of Gibbethon proclaim their general Omri as king and march back to Zimri's headquarters at Tisra to try and capture him. Panicked and desperate, Zimri burns his palace to the ground with him in it, and Omri becomes king in 879. As an aside, Zimri's reign of terror lasted a whole 7 days. If you recall back to me mentioning the Mesha stele, the one about the Moabites fighting against the Israelites, the inscriptions clearly reference King Omri, thus identifying him as a real historical figure. Now that's awesome, although not much is known about his 10-year-long reign. We know that he establishes a new capital for Israel at Samaria, a hill town northwest of Jerusalem, and he successfully brings Moab back under Israelite control, as well as make peace with Judah, or rather Judah makes peace with him. As the weaker of the 2 kingdoms, Judah put preservation before pride. If being a client state means getting to live, well then so be it. The current Judean king Jehoshaphat proclaims to Omri, "I am as you are, my people are your people, my horses are your horses." Succeeding Omri to the Israelite throne was his son Ahab in 868, who sought to sway the Phoenicians to his side and not Judah's. He seals that alliance through marriage to the Tyrian king's daughter, the princess Jezebel. That name might ring a bell, and chances are you're already drawing conclusions about her. After all, Jezebel has become a negative byword for any woman seen as immoral, promiscuous, femme fatale. But does she really deserve this reputation? As Josephus puts it, "This woman was active and bold and fell into so great a degree of impunity and madness that she built a temple to the god of the Tyrians, of whom the king learned to worship." Is it crazy to want a place to practice your own religion? In the modern sense, of course not. But for Josephus, the problem is not only that Jezebel had the audacity to commission these buildings, especially a temple to Baal inside the royal palace, but to convince her husband to worship with her. The once pious king of Israel has turned away from God because she made him. Somehow. Like what, she threatened him? Put him under a zombie curse? He's a grown man, a king. The only reason kings do anything is because they want to. Consider that much like Solomon before him, he's ordering these temples built to make his wife happy, and not for some nefarious purpose. Yes, it might look a little odd that an Israelite king is openly changing faiths, but so what? Jeroboam has already established that Israel is moving away from the rigidity of Judah's orthodox Yahweh worship. Allowing for some religious diversity means Ahab can prove how serious he is about the alliance with the Phoenicians. His conversion, as the text put it, was probably not a full-blown rejection of the Hebrew faith, but as a way to show his devotion to his wife and his commitment to his new in-laws. Or instead, you can see this as a time for full-on freak-out. Though the traditional leaders of the faith had mostly left for Judah, there were still many of these prophets who remained behind and repeatedly called for a return to the old ways. Chief amongst them was Elijah, who was seriously vociferous in his indignation over all this heresy, going so far as to publicly humiliate the priests of Baal on their failure to stop a drought. Yet while these prophets condemned and complained, they couldn't stop the proliferation of Phoenician gods or stop Israel from becoming a pluralistic society. Curiously, the Old Testament leaves out a major incident of Ahab's life in which we actually have historical evidence. Towards the later years of his reign, he joined a coalition of 11 other kings against the forces of Shalmaneser III and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Ahab's name and military contributions are recorded on an Assyrian monolith, along with the other rulers in their kingdoms. The Assyrians play a critical role in Israel's future, so instead of giving them a bare-bones discussion here, we'll catch up on their history in the next episode. For now, just know that Ahab and friends aren't able to score a truly decisive victory against Shalmaneser's superior army, but flex enough strength to hold him off for a while. Afterwards, Ahab goes to war against the Aramean king Ben-Hadad of Damascus, a fellow coalition fighter, but loses his life in battle. He leaves the crown to his son Joram, who continues the fight against the Arameans alongside Ahab's grandson Ahaziah, who happened to be the king of Judah conveniently enough. During one of these battles, Joram is wounded, and joined by Ahaziah, retreats to recuperate at the town of Jezreel. Now perhaps sensing this weakness in the royal line, the current leader of the prophets, Elisha, not Elijah, is divinely inspired to seek out a new king of Israel, someone who will purge the state of these heretic kings and their false religions. His choice is Jehu, a military captain. Anointed in a secret ceremony and hailed by his fellow soldiers, Jehu and his supporters furiously rode to Jezreel to confront the ailing king. A watchman loyal to Jehu convinces Joram to ride out of the city, Ahaziah as well, and the two kings in their chariots meet up with Jehu. Realizing that this was probably a trap, Joram asks him, "Do you come in peace, Jehu?" To which Jehu replied, "What peace, so long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?" The treachery revealed, Joram turned to flee, but Jehu had already lifted his bow and planted an arrow squarely through his heart. His men quickly overtook the stunned Ahaziah and had him murdered too. No witnesses. The bloody deed done, Jehu entered the city and rode to the royal quarters, where he knew Jezebel would be waiting. She could hear the commotion outside, but calmly applied her makeup, put on her finest robes, and looked out her window down onto her son's assassin. She spoke. Had Zimri peace, he who slew his master? Jehu ignores the historical reference and calls out, "Who is on my side? Who?" At which two palace eunuchs come out from behind Jezebel and defenestrate her. Jehu orders his chariots to trample her body and then bury whatever remained. Now, Jezebel putting on makeup and getting all dressed up was twisted through the ages to connect her to prostitutes. The whole painted women thing. Although what Jehu and everyone else failed to recognize is that Jezebel knew her time was up and chose to go out as would befit a queen, looking her finest with dignity and pride. For Jehu, he penned 7 letters to the elders at Samaria, essentially saying, "I'm the king, I just took care of the previous one, what are you going to do about it?" And the elders, of course, shrugged and agreed. They also looked the other way as Jehu's supporters had all of Ahab's descendants decapitated, some 70 in total, assembling their heads in 2 piles at the gates of Jezreel. Gruesome, and only the prelude to Jehu's violent masterpiece. Having now returned to Samaria, he announces to his advisors, "Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much." He declares there is to be a great sacrifice to Baal at the god's main temple, promising there's never been a sacrifice quite like what he's planning. Sounds exciting, and every influential worshipper of Baal, from priests to families, packed inside the temple to see what their new king had in store. That's when the doors to the temple suddenly slammed shut and were barred tight. Previously hidden, Jehu's guards pop out and surprise the terrified worshippers, butchering every single one. A great sacrifice indeed. Afterwards, the sacred statue of Baal is burned, the temple completely razed, with the ruins being designated a public toilet. This sets in motion the decline of Baal worship in Israel, for obvious reasons. What the text failed to mention, however, is the foreign policy nightmare Jehu had created. He murdered the king of Judah. He was a client ruler, not a threat. This created a power vacuum there, allowing Ahaziah's wife, Queen Athaliah, to seize power, murdering all other claimants to the throne and breaking ties with Israel. By murdering Jezebel, Jehu had already enraged Phoenicia, but then to defile a Phoenician god's temple and slaughter the people inside. Needless to say, the alliance between the Israelites and Phoenicia was over. Oh, and for good measure, King Hazael of Damascus comes roaring back to wage war on Israel. You see what happens when you don't think about your actions? Jehu had isolated his kingdom and put it in a dangerous spot. The prophets may have been thrilled with his choices so far, but Jehu was quickly realizing the futility of his situation. With seemingly no way out of this fiasco, he makes a bold decision. It was time to make a deal with the devil. Jehu journeyed to the court of Shalmaneser III, king of the almighty Neo-Assyrian Empire. In an event carved onto a black obelisk to be remembered for all time, Shalmaneser stands tall and proud, receiving tributes and offerings from the many nations he's conquered. And amongst those prostrating themselves before him was Jehu of Israel, the only representation we have of an Israelite king. Having the best military in the world at your back isn't something to sneeze at, although Jehu assumed they'd help him out pronto. Hazael was closing in, but the Assyrian army was off fighting in Babylonia and Urartu, what is now Armenia. Typical, right? You buy the insurance when things are fine, but as soon as there's trouble, you get stiffed. Hazael and his Arameans do a number on Israel's eastern territories and the defenders there. So much so that when Jehu dies around 822 BC, his son Jehoahaz inherits a military that has only 50 horsemen and 10 chariots left. Hazael's war machine continued to march through Israel, even entering Philistia. Judah wasn't on his list, however, as they had preemptively bought off his army. Finally, though, Assyria decided to uphold their end of the bargain. Their new king, Adad-nirari III, utterly demolished Hazael's forces, and they would never trouble Israel again. This calls for a celebration, and Adad-nirari insists the Israelites pay another tribute. Think of it as a service fee. In 796 BC, Israel begrudgingly pays off Assyria, an event recorded on another tablet, the Rima inscription. It might be highway robbery, but Israel is learning to play nice with other foreign countries for once. And without the threat of invasion anymore, they look to regain their lost footing. Starting in 788, the Israelites reclaim lost territory and expand beyond the Jordan River. The economy was picking up as well, as positive relations with Assyria provided new markets for their goods. Progress was finally being made, at the cost of their souls. Doomsday prophets like Amos took to the streets, bemoaning the current state of affairs. Heavy taxes were levied to pay the Assyrian tributes, but it seemed like the burden fell only on the poor. Rich landowners saw their plots drastically increase with newly conquered territories, but this meant more people were taken from their subsistence farms and told to work growing luxury crops like grapes for wine. And what really crumbled Amos's cookie was that those golden calves erected by Jeroboam had still not been taken down. Golden calves. No one has a problem with this? Even Jehu didn't do anything, and he turned a Phoenician temple into a porta potty. While Amos's message struck a deep chord with the populace, discontent was building and many wondered if God was angry with Israel. It didn't help that during this time a pretty big earthquake struck as well. It could be a natural geological phenomenon, but probably divine punishment. The situation hasn't improved when the new king Zechariah comes to power in 748 BC, but just 6 months into his reign, he's captured by an angry mob, marched out into a public square, and beheaded, ending the Jehu dynasty. The leader of that mob, Shallum, proclaims himself king, but only gets to rule for a month before he too is killed, this time by a loyal military leader named Menahem. He'd hold on to power for 10 years, but the bloodshed was far from over. To put it bluntly, in just 20 years from when Menahem took the throne, the kingdom of Israel would be no more, wiped off the map by the Assyrians. Before that happens, we need to learn a little bit more about them. Who are the Assyrians? Where did they come from? And most importantly, are the rumors true? That they make wallpaper from the skins of their enemies, and fashion crowns from their heads, or string the bodies of slain generals together to make banners? What is this, House Bolton? But seriously, the Assyrians field the scariest, most terrifying warriors of the ancient Near East. And by the way, those rumors are definitely true. So maybe it's not such a bad thing to buy their favor anyway. Although, what would happen if the money runs out? Or worse, someone doesn't want to pay anymore. Next time, it's a crash course through Assyrian history on the podcast History of Our World. For more information about the music of the ancient Hebrews featured in this episode, visit ancientlyre.com. As always, my sincere thanks to Michael Levy for allowing his authentic music to be featured today. You can support his efforts to bring the sounds of the ancient world to modern audiences by purchasing his albums on iTunes, Amazon, or Bandcamp.